Good day, and welcome to the world's democracies. How satisfied is the citizenry? This is a conversation hosted by Pew Research Center. I'm James Bell, the Center's Vice President for Global Strategy, and I have the privilege of moderating today's event. For those of you who might not be entirely familiar with the Pew Research Center, we are a nonprofit fact tank that informs public dialogue about the trends and developments shaping the future in the United States and around the globe. I say fact tank intentionally because the center is not only nonpartisan, we are also non-advocacy, meaning that we do not take positions, nor do we make recommendations with regard to policy. Today's event occurs on the eve of the Summit for Democracy that's being hosted by the Biden administration. And that summit commences in less than a couple of days, and our aim here is to hopefully provide direct access to the audience, those of you gathered here, to our experts, my colleagues at the center who've been collecting data in the United States and other countries on what citizens are actually thinking about the current state of democracy, their concerns about the future of democracy, their frustrations, what they think about institutions such as elections. All of that is part of what we've been looking at in recent years to understand, again, what citizens are thinking about the state and future of democracy. And we want to unite these facts from our research with a lively discussion about what are the implications or what can we take away from that research in terms of trying to anticipate what's ahead for democracy around the globe. Now, our immediate conversation is confined within kind of the parameters of your video monitor, but I'm very pleased to announce that we are also part of something much bigger, a global conversation that's being hosted by the Global Democracy Coalition Forum, which is a virtual forum occurring for 24 hours today, the 7th of December, 2021, and it's convened by the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance, known by the acronym IDEA. A couple of housekeeping notes. The center's event is being recorded, and we'll have that recording available on the center's website and on the Global Democracy Coalition Forum's website as soon as possible after the event has concluded. And we also want you to participate. So all audience members can submit questions. You just do so by using the submission box on the side of your screen. And I'll do my best to get to questions when we get to the question and answer period of the presentation, the event. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters and discussants. We're joined today by Richard Wike, who is the Director of the Global Attitudes Research at the Center, and Carroll Doherty, who is Director of U.S. Political Research at the Center. Each of them will present their findings about citizens are thinking about democracy, and then we'll have a discussion in which we are very privileged to have with us Polly Mackenzie, Chief Executive of Demoscracies, and Dr. Seema Shah, Head of International Ideas Democracy Assessment Unit, to help us lead us through that discussion about what these findings might mean in terms of what we can anticipate with regard to the future of democracy. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Jeb. It's great to be here and great to have a chance to talk a little bit about some of the international survey work that we do at the Pew Research Center. Democracy has been a major topic for our Global Attitudes team over the last few years. And today, my colleague Janelle Fedoroff and I actually released a data essay that reviews some of the major themes we've seen in our work on this topic over the past few years. We actually titled the essay Global Public Opinion in an Era of Democratic Anxiety. Obviously, if you look at trends regarding the health of democracy around the world over the past few years, it's been heading in a very negative direction. And some of our friends at International IDEA have a new report out today, which analyzes and describes some of those trends. In terms of our data, I think what it highlights are some of the concerns people have about the way democracy is working in their countries, and also highlights some of the things that I think people want from a healthy democracy. So what I'm going to do is just briefly today talk about some of the major themes that we've seen in our work and that we highlighted in that essay. So if you're going to pull up the slides, I'll walk through some of those findings. You can go ahead and move to the first slide. Before we jump into the findings, I'll talk just a little bit about the Pew Research Center and who we are and what we do. As Jeb said, we are nonpartisan, we're non-advocacy. We don't make policy recommendations, which makes us a little different from other think tanks in Washington and elsewhere. We're funded largely by the Pew Charitable Trust, although we do get funding from other sources as well. Next slide, please. So the first theme I wanted to talk about is this one. In many parts of the world, people say that democracy is not delivering for themselves or for their countries. And you see this in lots of different ways. Sometimes it's about economics. People say that the current state of their economy isn't good, or maybe they're worried about the long-term economic future. You see it when it comes to the pandemic. People who say that their country hasn't done a good job of dealing with the pandemic are more likely to be dissatisfied with the way democracy is working. Sometimes it's about fundamental democratic rights. People who don't think they have free speech, for example, in their country are much more unhappy with the way democracy is working. So all of these frustrations are leading in many places to calls for significant political reform. Next slide, please. And you can see that a little bit here on this slide. This is a question we asked in 17 advanced economies earlier this year. Do you think that the political system in your country needs to be completely reformed, that it needs major changes, minor changes, or no changes? And as you can see, not many people say our system needs no changes. And in fact, in most places, most people say either their political system needs major changes or a complete overhaul. And in places like Spain, South Korea, Italy, the US, you've got more than 8 in 10 who express that view. So there's a lot of frustration with how democracy is working. It's leading to calls for significant political reform in many places. Next slide. The second theme has to do with democratic values, and this is something I think we see in lots of ways in our surveys. Democracy essentially is a popular concept. People tend to like it, but they often aren't as committed to it as you might think or you might hope. Next slide. And you can see that a little bit here in this chart. This is a battery of questions that we've asked. Other survey researchers have asked them around the world as well. Essentially what we did is we read respondents 5 different types of governments. And for each one, we asked them whether this would be a good way or a bad way of governing. And these numbers that you see here are median percentages across the 38 countries where we asked this question in 2017. So when we do this, we find that representative democracy is a popular idea. Nearly 8 in 10 say it's a good way to govern. Many people also say that direct democracy could be a good way to govern. But there's also a lot of support for non-democratic alternatives as well. Things like rule by experts, rule by a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with courts or parliaments, or even military rule has its supporters. And some of these non-democratic approaches receive particular support on the ideological right in many countries. And, you don't only see it in, sort of less developed democracies. You see it in supposedly well-established, supposedly consolidated democracies as well. In the US, France, and Italy, for example, you've got nearly 1 in 5 respondents saying that military rule could be a good way to govern. So, again, overall, people like the idea of democracy, but they aren't always as committed to it as you might think. And that lack of commitment, I think, can open up political space for would-be autocrats to try to take advantage of. Next slide, please. The third theme is that political and social divisions are intensifying the challenges that democracies face in many parts of the world. And, sometimes this is about partisan divisions. Sometimes it's about divisions along racial and ethnic lines. And sometimes, over the past couple of years, it's been about the pandemic. Next slide, please. This is a question we've asked a couple of times over the past couple of years. Do you think that we are essentially more united as a country than before the pandemic, or more divided? And increasingly, what we've seen is that people say their countries are more divided now than they were before the pandemic. So, pre-pandemic, there existed all these fault lines in societies that can create challenges for democracy. And what we've seen is that people are telling us the pandemic has come along and made these divides even deeper. Next slide, please. And then a final theme I wanted to point out is that in many, many ways we see in our work that people are frustrated with political elites. They say elites are out of touch. They say elites don't care about average citizens. And in many instances, this is leading people to call for the public to have a stronger voice in politics and policymaking. Next slide, please. Here's a question I think illustrates some of this. This is one of our longer running trends in our international work at the center. And this is the share of people in a number of countries from around the world who agree with the statement, the state is run for the benefit of all in our country. Now, as you can see, the share of the public who thinks this has declined significantly in many places over the last 2 decades. And I think this reflects the fact that in many instances, citizens don't think their elected leaders are operating with the public's interest in mind. They're operating either with their own interest in mind, or maybe the interest of a narrow segment of the population. So they're frustrated with political elites, and as I said, often that results in calls for a more direct, stronger public voice in politics. And you see that in some ways with the interest we see in our surveys for things like direct democracy, the popularity of things like citizen assemblies, etc. So there's a lot of frustration, and that's leading people to want average citizens to have a stronger voice in politics. And I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn over to my colleague Carol. And Carol, you can tell us more about attitudes towards democracy, specifically in the U.S.
To the next slide. I'm Carroll Doherty. I'm the director of the domestic political research, as Richard said. And we see some of those themes specifically in American attitudes about the political system and elections. Go ahead and do the next slide. You can see the first thing I want to talk about is Americans' evaluations of their own political system and how well it's doing in some key areas. Now, this data was collected in 2020 before the election, so some of these attitudes might have changed, but I think the basic patterns are pretty interesting. Go ahead and show the next slide, please. And we asked about a number of areas of the political system, and as Richard noted, there's a lot of partisanship. You see it around how well the country is doing in protecting the right to protest peacefully, for instance, in this slide. But I'd point you to the bottom, the lower part of this chart, which shows that there's a good deal of bipartisan criticism of the political system in terms of views of campaign contributions leading to political influence, whether judges are free of political influence. And finally, the lowest item on this chart, do Americans agree on basic facts if they disagree politically? And very few, only about a quarter of Americans say they do, a pretty bleak assessment there, and one shared by both Republicans and Democrats. Next slide, please. And you can see here that, again, this is done in 2020. We compared it to the questions asked in 2018, the same questions asked in 2018, and you can see a downward tilt from 2018 to 2020, and we'll be updating this data in the next year or so. So it'll be interesting to see how these attitudes look in the Biden era. Next slide, please. And now we're going to move past the election, the 2020 election, the disputed 2020 election, and you can see here this is one of the fundamental challenges currently to American democracy. The fact is that a large share of Trump supporters, 75% of those who voted for Donald Trump in the election, simply refused to accept that Joe Biden legitimately won the election. Now, this survey was taken in January of this year. But we redid it in June, and we found very similar results. And I've included a CNN survey from September, which shows essentially the same thing, a large share of Republicans in this case saying that Biden was not legitimately elected, including 54% of Republicans who say there's solid evidence that this is the case. Of course, there's no such solid evidence, and this is a fundamental challenge to American democracy. Next slide, please. This gets into evaluations of voting, and again, here's the power of Trump's messaging to the Republican base, particularly when it comes to fraudulent voting. And what we're interested in is how these attitudes will impact both the 2022 midterm elections and the 2024 presidential elections. And you can see, the majorities in both parties say it's important that people who are not legally qualified to vote are prevented from voting. But relatively few Republicans are confident that this is happening in the wake of the 2020 election. Only 30% are confident versus about 75% or so of Democrats. And this is what is facing the country as we look forward to these next two elections. Next slide, please. I mean, voting itself has become a fundamental partisan dividing line in the United States. We ask a new question here. Basically, getting down to the essence of voting in the United States, is it mostly a fundamental right for all citizens and should be unlimited, or is it a kind of, does it need to be, is it a privilege for citizens that they should meet certain responsibilities? And you can see, again, the vast partisan divide with majorities of Republicans saying it's a privilege and majorities of Democrats saying it's a fundamental right for all citizens and should not be limited. Next slide, please. And finally, we get to the views of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol. And I would note that while we're headed into the Democracy Summit, we're almost a year off from this terrible event. And what's happened over time is that there's been a little erosion, again, especially among Republicans, in terms of the views of the importance of actually prosecuting those who rioted at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. You see that the share of Republicans who say this is a very important thing to do, to actually catch and prosecute those who rioted at the Capitol and broke into the Capitol that day, going from 50% in March to 27% in September. You see very high shares of Democrats, in essence, the public overall, saying this is very important. Next slide, please. And I would just put this in a broader context of our track, and others have tracked this over time. One of the oldest polling measures in the United States is whether Americans feel like they can trust the government always or most of the time. And this goes all the way back to the Eisenhower administration. You can see these large percentages back in the 1950s and 60s who say they could trust the government. But for more than a decade, it's that percentage has hovered around 20%. And you see that little spike there. That's in the wake of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when the country really did rally together, and there was a great deal of trust in government, albeit short-lived, after that event. But over the last decade or 15 years, it's hovered around 20%, and there's been no equivalent rise or sort of rally around the effect with the pandemic, as Richard noted in some of his evaluations. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jim, and he'll launch a discussion among our guests. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carol. And thanks so much, Richard. You gave us a lot to think about, and I want to bring our panelists in just a moment. One note, just practical. For everyone in the audience, don't forget, if you have questions, you can submit them anytime just using the submission box on the side of your screen. And we do look forward to questions from those gathered and joining us at this event today. Without further ado, let me introduce our very esteemed panelists. We're very fortunate to have with us two people who have thought a lot about democracy and are actively thinking about what's ahead in terms of the future of democracy. So this is a great opportunity to have a really meaningful and meaty conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Mackenzie, who's currently chief executive of Demos in the UK. Demos is a leading cross-party think tank, or the leading cross-party think tank in the UK. Polly started her career as a business journalist, and in 2004, she became a policy advisor on housing and local government for Edward Davey, MP. She then worked for the Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom from 2006 to 2015, serving as Director of Policy for 5 of those years. After leaving government, Polly established the operations of the Women's Equality Party and went on to found the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute, a charity working to break the link between financial difficulty and mental health problems. Welcome, Polly. And we're also joined by Dr. Seema Shah, who is currently the head of International Ideas Democracy Assessment Unit, which produces a biennial Global State of Democracy report. Very apropos what we're talking about today. It's annually updated by the Global State of Democracy Indices and an EU co-funded COVID-19 Global Monitor on Democracy and Human Rights. Dr. Shah previously served as a research and strategy lead for the International Rescue Committee's Humanitarian Innovation Department in the Middle East region. And prior to that, she worked on electoral reform in the US, South Asia, and Africa. Welcome, Dr. Shah. So I'm going to use first names. I'm Jeb. So Polly, Seema, I really want to bring you into this conversation. The first question I just want to get things started with is, Polly, I'll turn to you first, but Seema, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. The question is, thinking about what you've just heard from Richard and Carol in terms of what we found at the Pew Research Center in the US and other countries. I mean, what do you see as the major trends or developments regarding democratization that you would say to the audience today, these are the things you need to keep front and center as you think about the future of democracy? Polly, your thoughts?
Thank you so much. Really fascinating to hear those presentations. For me, I think they're a reminder of actually how fragile democracy is. I remember the fall of the Berlin Wall and having a chunk of the Berlin Wall that my sister had brought home from an exchange visit. And I remember, being a teenager and, at the time that Francis Fukuyama was describing, liberal democracy as potentially the end of history and a settled way that humanity might have established as the best way of governing. And it feels to me that over the course of my adult life, all of that certainty, perhaps arrogance, has fallen away. And it feels that democracy is now massively contested in just the way that your research is suggesting. And I think that has happened partly because of, arrogance, complacency about the fact that because democracy is based on a set of ethical premises about the rights of individuals in a collective, that therefore it would automatically succeed, despite the fact that, of course, it's maths, right? Like 50% of voters are below average intelligence, 50% of us are below average kindness. We're full of cognitive biases. We have homophily. We just mostly like people who are like us more than people who aren't like us. We've got present bias and loss aversion. And, you can just go through all the ways in which we are predictably irrational. So why would we imagine that this system of empowering equally the worst of us and the best of us would lead to a good system of government? And the reality is that democracy is in a permanent state of competition with other systems of government. It isn't just the pinnacle because it's based on an ethical premise. And if we cannot make the case, if we cannot prove that democracy is ineffective and good, if we can't make an instrumental case for democratic principles rather than the ethical one, in the end, it will fail. And that's where I think the fragility comes from. I think we've overpromised democracy as being perhaps the idea that because you get to vote, you get what you want. But actually, democracy is not about getting what you want. It's about getting what we can live with. It's a vast act of compromise. And in order to sustain that compromise, you need those things that Pew are researching. You need trust in the system of government. You also need to like each other. Because if you're compromising with other citizens within a society, you need to feel that they are people who are worth compromising with. So that's what we're working on at Demos, is to try and think about what is that demos in a democracy? What is the fabric of relationships between individuals, bridging capital as well as bonding capital between people who are like one another? and the relationship between people and the democracy which is supposed to be serving them. And if you can't build up those bonds, then in the end, democracies will be unable to solve their collective problems. And those other systems of government, which are out there, strongman government, authoritarian government, will find it easier to resolve collective problems and potentially prevail. So for me, all of this is a reminder that we need to do deep thinking about the fabric, the relational fabric of making a democracy work, and no longer pretend to people that it's not that giant act of compromise that's worth making, because it can lead to a stronger society, one in which trust and relationship actually lead to better outcomes and better resolutions of our collective problems, better opportunities for people, so that we can then prevail against those authoritarian regimes in which the individual is sacrificed to the collective will.
Fascinating comments, Polly. I mean, you touched on a number of things that, yes, are in our data, but you've taken it further. I just want to emphasize for our audience, what I'm hearing, the importance of that relational fabric, as you call it, the challenge of compromise, the possibility that democracy is, I'll just call it a possibility, not inevitable, that we have to work at it, and instrumental democracy is really important. I think those are really key observations to consider. Seema, from your perspective, I mean, what are those major trends and developments, in addition to what Polly already highlighted, that you would bring to our attention?
So I think everyone that's spoken already touched on some of these trends in one way or another, but sort of to set the context maybe from of our latest Global State of Democracy report, what we see is that authoritarianism is on the rise in a worrying way. What we're seeing now is that the number of democracies has declined compared to when we last produced this analysis 2 years ago, when we were seeing the number of democracies actually increasing. Now it's dropping. And also we're seeing that since 2016, the number of democracies moving in the direction of authoritarianism exceeds the number of countries moving towards democracy by a factor of 3, which is pretty significant. But maybe more important than that, what we're seeing is that the quality of governance inside existing democracies is declining. So even in places that are still democracies, whether high-performing, weak, mid-performing, we see erosion. So we're seeing declines on at least one of our indicators, statistically significant decline on at least one indicator, and that backsliding, where legitimately elected leaders are dismantling the building blocks of democracy from within the democratic system. We see backsliding has never been as prevalent today in the last decade as it is today. So those are sort of big trends we're seeing. But I would say that, to build on what Polly just said, some of the reason for this is because there are these long-standing issues which have not been sufficiently addressed in existing democracies. And we see this through things like inequality, all forms of inequality. This has been a problem for decades and decades and has not been sufficiently addressed. And so what we saw now in the pandemic, for instance, is that those economic and racial inequalities in society were sort of magnified when we saw who suffered the most from the impact of the pandemic in a very tragic way. Corruption, our sort of scores on corruption from 1975 through today, that corruption indicator is one of the most stagnant. There's been no movement on corruption at all in the past quarter of a century. So that's very worrying. And then a new challenge, I think, is how democracies are delivering or not delivering when it comes to environmental sustainability. And so when you're looking forward for the next generation and what kind of hope we can inspire in them, this is a challenge that has been voiced very loudly around the world from younger generations. And democratic governments are not doing enough so far to address that in a way that's inspiring. So I would say the problems actually that we're facing are not new. It's just that they're now, they've sort of hit a tipping point where if we don't do something urgently, then hope in the promise of democracy dwindles.
So, Seema, if I could stay with you for a second and then turn to Polly. One question from the audience that's already come in is, I think, an important question. You're kind of touching on it. I'd just like to hear where you land and where Polly lands on this. And that is, are we in a moment where kind of there's like the bandwagon of pessimism? I mean, is this pessimism kind of becoming a narrative of its own? Is there really a crisis of democracy? Or are we really seeing signs or developments that are worrying? So, Seema, I think I hear you saying your research is seeing real world challenges or problems. It's not just a narrative of pessimism. Is that fair?
I think there is, of course, reason to be pessimistic, but there's also reason to be hopeful. I mean, one of our big findings is that across the world during the pandemic, populations did not sit back and sort of take it. So in democracies and in non-democracies, what we saw is that protests, for instance, have never been as prevalent as they are today. So over the course of the pandemic, some 80% of countries around the world had some protest movement ongoing despite restrictions on the freedom of expression and freedom of movement. So people are not willing to sit back and just be silent about things that they are not satisfied about. So that's one very, very important finding, is that it's not, even if things are not looking great, people still have hope and are acting on that hope. The other thing I would say is that we're seeing more innovative forms of participation, like someone mentioned citizens' assemblies recently, which I think provide a lot of hope. There's, within the field of technology, lots of new ways that people can participate much more easily and efficiently than they could before. So I think, yes, there's reason to worry, and I think we should worry, but I think there's enough will across the world and hope that if we act now and take advantage of it, we can reverse the trend. And that's the beautiful thing about democracy, is that it's self-correcting and it's resilient. And that's what we have seen throughout the course of the pandemic as well.
So, Polly, you clearly at Demos have not given up, because as you said, you're actively trying to address some of the things you highlighted, like the relational fabric. Where do you land, though, on whether this is really a moment of pessimism or crisis? Or how would you characterize the moment we find ourselves in with regard to democracy?
So, both. And here's why. So, in political philosophy, you always get this kind of like different. You've got Hobbes on the one side saying that naturally we're all brutal and nasty, and then Rousseau on the other saying, no, we all just sort of swan about being nice and cuddly. And then, I don't know, in modern era, you've got sort of the Christian right talking about original sin and how we need to sort of be controlled. And then you've got somebody like Rutger Bregman talking about how we're, humankind and that we're actually naturally nice. And then you see it in kind of evolutionary biology as well, where some people say, oh, look, we're just like chimpanzees. They're our closest relatives, and naturally we just beat each other up a lot. And then others who say, no, we're just like bonobos who like mostly just cuddle each other and are terribly friendly. And I'm always baffled by this, because it seems to me that, again, both are true. It's the yin and yang, is that humans have these extraordinary tendencies towards selfishness and violence and cruelty, and extraordinary tendencies towards kindness and compassion and altruism. And where does this fit with democracy? Is that I think what we have failed to do is design democracy for humans. A bit like in economics. Classical economics has this model of the rational, self-optimizing individual. And over the course of particularly the last kind of 40 years, there's been a better understanding that actually humans are not that. Humans are filled with these biases. And yet I think we've also built a democracy that is built on the assumptions that people are self-optimizing rational individuals. What would democracy look like if we were to build it with the peculiarities of the human species in mind? And I think for that, we would need to think about, well, given that humans have this homophily tendency to like people who are like them, but of course we are like each other in all sorts of different ways, depending on how we feel, how you feel about people within the nation state, whether you're self-identifying on the basis of, your football team, the color of your skin, the neighborhood you live in, or all of those different things. And so given that people are going to naturally like people like them, how do you engineer communities so that people put primacy on communities that are diverse and representative and not other forms of community, for example? And I sort of fundamentally feel it's that overselling of democracy, as if it's getting what you want is part of this. And also the sort of, I guess, a technocratic instinct from policymakers, which is that because people are busy, sometimes stupid, sometimes self-interested, it's much better to actually not have government by the people, but government for the people. And that representative democracy is kind of sufficient, getting the people out to the ballot box every now and then. And so all you have to make democracy work is the kind of the competitive thing that, you know, if you're rubbish, you'll get voted out. And that's all we ask of citizens. And we'll do all the hard work for them. And I think that's really, really dangerous. And it's led to this kind of bifurcation. On the one hand, there's people who are trying to design a democracy. And I think that the deliberative stuff that we're hearing about there is absolutely central to this, that really is asking more of citizens, of expecting them to participate, expecting them to build up the citizen skill set rather than just the atomized consumer skill set, which we need for the rest of our lives. And there's another set of people who are trying to, I guess, plug into the worst instincts of human beings and build authoritarian narratives of government based on outsiders and division. And both people are plugging into natural facets of the human character, right? For me, the question is, if we're carrying on doing democracy for people and assuming that they'll just be grateful because they'll somehow understand that some clever people made some decisions for them, that has failed. So we need to redesign democracy, and the choice is whether it's going to go down the authoritarian, divisive identity politics route, or, which in my view will never actually solve any of our policy problems, or whether we can re-engineer the mechanisms and the institutions of democracy to somehow plug them into the best of human instincts. And that technocratic belief that because people have bad instincts, you just need to sort of shut them off from decision making and do things for them, that is the most dangerous thing, which is driving and opening up, as Seema was just saying, that space for an authoritarian set of reforms.
So what I'm hearing between the two of you then is there's still hope, there's promise. Democracy has within it the seeds because it invites participation and change to some degree, but it's not going to be easy, and it will require a lot of citizens in ways that perhaps we haven't always considered to be as central. Well, I want to talk about the context we find ourselves in a little bit more, and I'd like to bring in Richard and Carol too. At different moments, each person on our panel today has talked about the pandemic, and I'd like to try to address a couple questions we've gotten from the audience about the impact of the pandemic on what citizens are thinking and expecting of democratic governance, and also how it has intersected with just what you've talked about, in particular, whether we're in different camps or realities even. Can we even come together? So maybe, Carol, I know a couple of people were very curious about this idea of shared reality. And against the backdrop of the pandemic, where are we in the United States as a case study on a shared reality that might allow us to tackle some of the things that Polly and Seema have talked about?
Crisis.
Just waiting for Carol to come over. There he is.
Okay. This was a crisis for the United States, as it was for all the advanced economies. And you know, the partisan polarization we've seen building up over the last several years, we see it in stark relief in reactions to the pandemic, obviously. And I think one of the things we saw, and I think it doesn't get enough attention, was the degree to which these attitudes around elections have kind of connected to the pandemic as well. We never had much in the way of absentee voting in the United States prior. You know, there were certain states that did it. A handful of states emphasized different alternative means of voting rather than showing up on the polling place on the day of the election. But of course, with the pandemic, you know, you had to change that, and so absentee voting came into more in vogue. And again, the Republican messaging around that was that this was particularly flawed, And that became the basis for some of these, again, groundless challenges that Trump made against the election. So you can see how the pandemic affected the 2020 election and sort of exacerbated some of the divides that already existed.
And Richard, just to give you a chance to put the U.S. in a more global context, you mentioned how perception of division in more than one country seems to have intensified. Could you say a bit more about that with the backdrop of the pandemic?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting about that question is when we first asked it in 2020, the U.S. was a pretty big outlier. It was one of the few places that said, we're actually more divided than we were before the pandemic. We went back and asked that question again in 2021, and many other parts of the world were starting to look more and more like the U.S. They increasingly became likely to say that, instead of being united by this crisis, we're seeing division in society grow. So I think that's been one thing where we've seen the rest of the world sort of in a negative way catching up with the U.S. and becoming more and more likely to say that, the pandemic's had a negative impact on social unity. And, of course, that leads to greater dissatisfaction with the way democracy is working overall. How you feel about how your country has handled this crisis has a big impact on what you think about the way democracy is working in your country.
Yeah, and if I can just stay on our global researcher for a second, we did get a question from the audience, which is one that's quick, I think, to answer, but it really deserves to be answered, which is why did we focus on 17 advanced economies when we're talking about democracy, which is not limited as an issue or a form of government to those 17 countries? And the reason is the pandemic. Pew Research Center relies on face-to-face survey research in much of the world, and that has not been possible to do in an ethical and public health conscious way since the pandemic. So that's the main reason we're talking about advanced economies. At the same time, I do think that these 17 countries, because of their comparable economic development levels, are very useful to compare. In part, Seema mentioned that, inequality in this context is one of the things we need to consider as a factor in whether people are able to see that social cohesion or they're seeing more division, as Richard's talking about. I wonder for Polly and Seema in particular, Richard, in the surveys that results he was sharing, talked about the appeal of technocratic or even military rule, strong leader. We've certainly heard why democracy can be resilient, why it still has potential. I'm curious, Polly, start with you and then Seema, if you have thoughts about what might be, and this is some speculation perhaps, but I'm ask it anyway, what might be the appeal of a more authoritarian or a stronger leader model compared to what people are experiencing in democracy today? Polly, any thoughts?
I mean, it's hell is other people, right? Like, people who disagree with me are annoying as a fundamental basis of reality. It's like, I don't know, in Matilda, Miss Trunchbull says that the school would be far better without the children in it. And that's the thing, is it is difficult and frustrating to make the compromises of democracy with other people. And so a feeling, and of course we all have a kind of an optimism bias that we think that an authoritarian government would somehow be on our side or do the right thing, and forget that it might in fact be authoritarian against us and people like us, which is of course, one of the essential risks. But it's also, I guess, a distaste that we have for complexity, and a wish to devolve all of this complexity, the decision making, the compromises, to somebody else who will just tell us what to do and fix it for us. The problem is that actually, and so I've written about this in a paper I've just published as part of a series, but is that if you look at the particular challenges that we face today, so many of them require subtle and complex shifts in individual and human behavior, climate change, living in a diverse society demographically, how we deal with and regulate AI or the information economy, how we interact with one another online. if you're going to fix these problems, you have to change individuals. And so actually authoritarianism would have to intervene in our lives so dramatically that I think it's an illusion, but that it would ever actually make things better. But I can understand the appeal of the illusion. It's that somebody else will take your problems away and fix them and get rid of those inconvenient other people who have the audacity to disagree with you.
Polly, I appreciate you touching on a couple key aspects there that are, I think, part of what our research is talking about, that trust or willingness to compromise and to embrace others, so to speak, that might not be seen as the same as you. And then, as you said, kind of just take those problems away, have someone else deal with them. Seema, I'm curious, what your thoughts are, and maybe in particular, if you have any thoughts or observations on why authoritarian models might appeal just on the basis of how democracies are performing on an issue like the pandemic compared to others, regimes.
Sure. So I think it's very easy to see authoritarian regimes as more efficient, first of all. It's easier when you don't have checks and balances to be able to come up with a solution and implement it. It's faster in some ways. It takes more time and it takes more effort and more compromise to make decisions in a system that requires you to respect rights. And so things take longer. It means that what you initially started out with may not be what you end up with because it requires compromises, as Polly has said. And so all this it means you have to maybe give up some of what you initially wanted, and that's difficult. And it's also frustrating when you have to wait for a decision to be made and for the impact of that decision to trickle down to you. But of course, and there's also this, authoritarian leaders and regimes are also loud. And so there's this narrative, right, that this rhetoric that for an authoritarian regime, that's actually better for economic performance and pandemic management. But that's actually not true. We commissioned for our latest report at the difference between authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes in pandemic response, and found is that authoritarian regimes do not do better in pandemic management than democratic regimes. When you look at things like death rates or number of cases of COVID or vaccination rates, they don't do better. So it's a false narrative, but they're really loud about it. So democracies, I feel one thing is that they need to be louder. But before I stop talking, I just want to go back to what Polly said before, which really struck me about political institutions not being designed for humans. And I think one of the things we said in our report is that democratic institutions are not designed for citizens. They're designed for elites. And so one of the things that we're recommending is that institutions need to be brought into the 21st century, not just in terms of efficiency and ease, but in terms of who you're thinking about. We recommend that those institutions be redesigned with the most marginalized and the most vulnerable front and center. Imagine the kinds of institutions and norms and procedures you would have if those were the people that were at the center of your design process, and how much easier it would be. When we think about democracy, we should be thinking about how to facilitate rights, not how to treat things as a privilege, right? Or how to lock people out. It should be about how do you maximize participation for everyone, not just the people who have the easiest access, but for everyone. And one really great example of this is how campaign finance and money in politics works around the world. If you're in a system where most people don't have the money or the time or the access to political leaders, and the system that is in place actually facilitates, it makes it really easy if you're a big company or you're a really wealthy individual to access leaders. What is the incentive for your average voter to participate in that part of the process or to feel motivated to vote if they know that people with a lot more money than them have access to those leaders? What is the incentive? It's a very difficult. That is not designed for a lay citizen. That's just one example, but this is something that we're thinking about a lot. How do you redesign with the most marginalized at the center?
Thanks, Seema. I want to bring Carol back for a moment. I just want to acknowledge that I'm trying to weave in audience questions in our conversation. So I'm not reading questions explicitly, but I'm trying to incorporate some of what's being asked. One question I don't think we can tackle, which is, what are citizens and what I think, might be, described as more authoritarian settings thinking compared to citizens and democracy? It's a really important question. We cannot answer that with our research at the center. But we are mindful of the importance of citizens exist in different contexts, and that is a good point. But one of the things that's come up in different ways, Carol, is we know from your research that you shared and what Richard shared, there's criticism and frustration among American citizens about how democracy is working. And yet people are wondering, kind of like Polly and Seema are suggesting, what are those opportunities to change things? And what can you share about Americans and their support for, let's say, constitutional reform or other kinds of reforms that Seema and Polly have talked about, which would change the institutions to some degree? What is our research showing about American citizens and their attitudes towards those kinds of changes?
Well, I think you see some of the same partisan polarization as you see on climate change and other issues in the United States. It's deeply polarized. And in part, I think people recognize how these changes might impact their own party's fortunes. And so they're strategic in the way that they answer some of those questions. And I would put the U.S. Electoral College, which of course is rather than the popular vote in terms of electing presidents, it's this electoral college. And, you see a huge partisan divide. Understandably, Republicans have seen their advantage in the electoral college over the last several elections. You've had President Trump in 2016 being elected without getting the plurality of the popular vote. And you saw that back in 2000 as well for a Republican president. Republicans are wary of that, in part because of how it might impact their party's fortune. Democrats, 70% or more, support that. And I think you see this on other electoral forms. You see it on the question we asked about, is voting a fundamental right for all citizens, or is it more of a privilege? And so the expansion of the franchise itself is controversial in the United States. And Republicans justify this, of course, on the basis that expanding the franchise would lead to more fraud.
Thanks, Carol. I think that question about privilege versus right voting is a fantastic question. As an example, we did get someone in the audience ask, are we changing our questions that we ask about democracy, given everything we're talking about today? I think the answer, absolutely. We are exploring different ways of asking about democracy. We're doing more qualitative work to try to get behind, what are people thinking about when they think about democracy? So please check out the landing page that we kind of housed all our democracy related content on. It'll give you a sense for how we are changing our questions. But thanks for asking about our research approach. Before we run out of time, and we're getting closer to the hour, the area that we don't get into is policy and speculating too much about what's going to happen in government. But we have this Summit for Democracy coming up. So Polly and Seema, I'm going to lean on you guys. I don't want you to predict what will come out of it, but how, we have a group of people gathered here today listening to us, asking us questions. I think everyone kind of wonders, what expectations should we place on something like this Summit for Democracy? And in particular, could you maybe link that to another question, how much is America's standing or reputation as a functioning democracy or a healthy democracy, and any questions about that today, a factor in how the conversation about democracy and Americans' leadership on this issue unfolds? It's a lot, but I'm going to try to foist it on you guys. So Polly, maybe you could go first.
I think, it's a really dangerous time. America, for all of its faults, like every country has faults, has been a leader in the fight for democracy. Was kind of a leader, I think, in that set of arrogant assumptions I talked about before, that because democracy and, the economic freedoms of capitalism, which people assumed went together hand in glove, that freedom-loving peoples around the world, that it would just thrive. And And if America falls off that leadership role and its democracy starts to eat itself, I think that's, catastrophic for those of us who want to support and go back to an environment where democracy is slowly empowering and liberating citizens around the world, and not in a state of decline. I think that has to come from reform of democratic processes and institutions. Absolutely. I like to think about the word iconoplastic. You'll know that in physics, plastic means that when you squish it, it stays changed, unlike elastic. And I think unless you are iconoplastic about your institutions, you open up space for iconoclasts who just want to smash them to pieces. And we don't default to a Rousseauian kind of kindness at that point. We resort to tribalism and division. But I do think it's more than that. I think that fundamentally you have to think about the demos as much as you think about the ocracy part. It's not just the institutions. It's why would people want to make compromises with one another? And, I'm mostly a policymaker, kind of by expertise. And, a lot of problems you get in policy are collective action problems. And, Hobbes talks about this, about like, basically sort of policing the commons is that if everybody fishes, then you've got no fish and everybody loses out. So actually a shared agreement about how much people are going to fish helps everybody. So huge numbers of policy problems are collective action problems like that. And so long as you trust the system to work, there is an individual incentive for participating and making those compromises. But just as many policy problems are not collective action problems. They are just trade-offs. They are not ways where we all benefit from working together. Actually, a landlord and a tenant, your regulations pretty much going to fall to benefit one or the other. And our society is riven by these things. And why are you willing to make those compromises? It has to be on the basis of the relationships you have with other people. And because people tend to prefer people who are like them, you have to work really, really hard at building up. And, so I've just published a paper called The Gravitational State about how everything from public service design through to the institutions of democracy can enable and reinforce and build up those kind of microscopic interactions about who knows who's friends with who's met who has whose phone number, to build up that sense that we are in this together. Because when people do feel that we're in this together, they are willing to make extraordinary compromises and sacrifices, as we saw through the pandemic. That part of human nature is just as true as the most brutal. And yet it has to be reinforced very actively by the state. And I think for a long time, we assumed that would happen by default. But because of technological, demographic, and environmental change, it cannot happen by default. It's not happening by default. We are seeing the fragmenting of the demos, and we need that gravitational state to build the demos. Otherwise, you can't possibly hope for democracy to be resilient in the long term.
So Seema, Polly, thank you, Polly. Polly's, highlighted, I think I could describe it in some ways, the challenges within a democracy. But you and your team, Seema, are constantly thinking about democracy across countries. And the Summit for Democracies is about bringing elites together to talk about what's happening with democracy around the globe. So to build on what Polly was saying about some of the very real challenges and what might be required to reinvigorate democracy, I mean, what are your thoughts? You have a Summit for Democracy, you have an international gathering. What are your thoughts about what to expect or what role it has to play in promoting democracy?
I think actually the main role, what the summit does is bring people together in a beautiful moment to focus attention on this and to set goals for the next year and the next 2 years. And I think the beauty of that is that we then have a package which we in the international community can hold organizations and countries and leaders accountable for. So we can finally say, you said this was a priority for you and you promised to work on X, Y, and Z thing. And we're going to keep track and we're going to call you out when you're not fulfilling your promises. That's never been done on a global scale. So that's one lovely thing. The other thing that's come out of this so far is having these sort of side events where organizations and individuals and groups that are thinking about these kinds of questions have an opportunity to come together before and after and forge those networks. One of the things we saw is that authoritarian regimes share their playbooks, right? They mimic each other. And democracies don't do enough of that. This is a chance for us to share what works and what doesn't work, and work together and build relationships and networks, and be there to support each other. And so I think those are the kinds of sort of side benefits that will come out of this, in addition to the main thing, which I think is a chance for us to hold leaders accountable.
Thank you, Seema. We have reached the top of the hour, so it is my unfortunate privilege, I guess, to say that we are going to wrap up. But I want to thank, in particular, Seema Shah, Mackenzie, for joining us in this discussion. I want to thank my colleagues, Richard Wike and Carroll Doherty, for giving us such a meaty set of data and findings to discuss as part of this exploration about, what are the key trends and developments shaping the future of democracy. I'll just riff off of what Seema just shared about the emphasis on we. I think one of the things I heard throughout this conversation today, both from my colleagues at the center, but also from Polly and Seema, is who the we are. That's a big question, and whether we recognize others to be part of the we and what we are going to do about democracy. So I'll leave everyone with that thought, and thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you again to all our panelists and our presenters today. It's been a wonderfully helpful and, I hope, enlightening conversation. Thank you all.